I would also like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking to you today from the city of Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Amid an ongoing and challenging wildfire season, we have just concluded a productive meeting of federal, provincial, territorial ministers responsible for emergency management. As of today, there are 477 wildfires burning across Canada, 237 of which are determined to be out of control, and approximately 8 million hectares have burned so far this year. My colleagues and I have come to the table with fresh perspectives on our minds to share experiences and lessons learned so that we can bolster our collective preparedness for future climate-related disasters and extreme weather events. And as we gather today, our thoughts have been with the very many Canadians across the country who have been affected by wildfires and flooding in recent weeks. I've had the opportunity recently to travel to Nova Scotia and to Alberta to thank some of the first responders, the firefighters, search and rescue personnel, and many of whom are volunteers who bravely battled the historic and dangerous fires in those two provinces. And I have also had the opportunity to meet with some of the people who've been impacted by those fires, who've lost their homes and their livelihoods, and to provide them with reassurances that all orders of government will work with them and for them to make sure that they are able to recover and return to their communities and to their lives as quickly as possible. And today, during our meeting, my colleagues and I took time to recognize the historic work of first responders and many others, including local volunteers and members of the Canadian Armed Forces. We all agreed on the need for emergency management partners to bolster disaster resilience, emergency preparedness, and response capabilities in Canada together. We reviewed the Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangements Program, and we discussed the recommendations of the expert panel's recently published final report, particularly in light of the significant increase in climate-related disasters that provinces and territories have been facing. We discussed the development of a low-cost national flood insurance program to transfer financial risk from homeowners to insurers, and the need to clarify roles, responsibilities, and priorities for all orders of government. As part of our review of the ongoing work on the National Public Alerting System, we considered the recommendations of the recent Mass Casualty Commission final report related to public alerting. We heard an update on the steps in the development of a national public safety broadband network, and ministers underscored the varying needs across different regions of our vast country. And finally, we discussed the major progress that is being made on emergency management initiatives in the 2021-22 Emergency Management Strategy Interim Action Plan. We've agreed to extend the Interim Action Plan to December of 23 as we continue advancing on its 5 strategic actions, including continuing FPT engagement to ensure strong cohesion for emergency management, improving pan-Canadian understanding of disaster risk, and reducing flood risks across Canada. And as we closed our meeting today, we made plans to meet again this fall and to hold a dedicated session with national Indigenous organizations. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my many colleagues from across the country for their continued collaboration around the table and the real results that it produces for Canadians. We also acknowledge the work that the provinces and territories have been doing to support each other during this very challenging wildfire season. The scale, frequency, and severity of climate-related disasters will unfortunately continue to grow, but the work we undertake together across all orders of government and with Indigenous partners will help to ensure that Canadians are protected and our communities remain resilient and safe. Thank you very much. Merci. And I now turn the microphone over to my friend and colleague, Minister Doyle Piwniuk from Manitoba.
Thank you, Minister Blair. I now invite the Honourable Doyle Piwniuk, Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure of Manitoba, to speak. Over to you, Minister Piwniuk.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and thanks, Minister Blair, for the opportunity to co-chair with you on the FPT for EMO. It's great to be part of the discussion. When it comes to Manitoba, is committed to working with our partners across the countries, with our fellow partners, with the other provincial and territory ministers, and really the advance of mitigation and recovery solutions against all types of disasters to ensure resiliency and safety for all Canadians. We continue to focus on proactive measures to reduce impacts of future natural disasters, such as wildfires that we're experiencing now here in Manitoba, and also floods that we had, again, one of the second worst floods in 2022. My colleagues and I have made significant progress in moving forward towards a long-term solutions to emergencies and disasters. The work discussed today represents the accumulation of significant collaborations that will continue to guide efforts to promote shared priorities to strengthen Canadian communities. So I look forward to any questions and opportunities to share what we've talked about this today as a group, and I look forward to working again with my colleagues when we meet again in December.
Thank you, Minister Piwniuk. We'll now open the floor to questions. To give everyone a chance to participate, please limit yourself to one question and one follow-up. We'd also be grateful if you could specify which minister you would like to direct your questions to. In typical Zoom fashion, just go ahead. If you have a question, raise your hand and I will call on you. All right, we will start with CBC, Cameron McIntosh. Please go ahead.
Hi, for Minister Blair. Speaking of the forest fire situation, we're in an unprecedented situation in the province right now. We have fires in 7 out of 10 provinces, 2 territories, 16 times the normal amount of acreage burned than normal in a normal year. I'm wondering, in terms of management, can the federal government, or is the federal government looking at perhaps the way we manage our resources on a national scale? Because what I'm hearing from all the provinces right now is they're stretched. They can't get enough people, even when we bring in hundreds of people from outside the country. I spoke to a firefighter from France today who said he's not sure he can stay. His country's starting to burn. So I guess my general question here is, if we're getting into a warmer climate and this is more the norm, what do we need to be doing, or what can we be doing to ensure the safety of lives and property going forward?
Thank you very much, Cameron. It's an important question. And let me also acknowledge, we have seen an incredibly difficult fire season. It started earlier than previous seasons. And unfortunately, just this past week, we've now passed the threshold to make the current fire season and the acreage burnt, which is now in excess of 8 million hectares, the worst in our recorded history. And so, yes, and what, and that's not to suggest, by the way, this is the new normal. But what it does suggest, and very strongly, is because we've witnessed this over the past several years, is that the severity and frequency of these events is increasing year over year. And as a consequence, what we're seeing is a very strong trend line towards the need for building out a stronger response. And let me also take the opportunity to acknowledge, Cameron, that the provinces and territories have been exemplary in their response to the events that we've seen in Alberta, in Nova Scotia, now in Quebec and Ontario, in British Columbia and Manitoba, and in Saskatchewan, the Northwest Territories. As you said, 7 of the 10 provinces have been experiencing very challenging fire seasons. But what we have also seen in this country is it's the primary responsibility for responding to these events does lie with the provinces and territories. We work very closely in support of them and in collaboration with them. They've been there to support each other. So when the fires, for example, broke out in Alberta, we saw firefighters coming from a number of different provinces to help them. And then as we've seen an increase in the fire season in Nova Scotia, Quebec, and other parts of Canada, we've reached out through the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Service, CIFC, that center, and they do excellent work actually on everyone's behalf in coordinating not only the movement of people, equipment, and water bombers between provincial and territorial jurisdictions, but also reaching out to international partners. Currently, there are close to 2,000 international firefighters that have come to Canada. That's a reciprocal arrangement. Canadian firefighters go to their countries during their fire season, and as you've indicated, we've even had firefighters coming in from Europe and Spain, Portugal, and in France. So I understand that the firefighters deployed into Quebec right now are going through a rotation, and additional firefighters will be coming in. But certainly in response to this season, I think there has been an exemplary response by all our provincial and territorial partners. They've worked hard, and I appreciate that their resources have been stretched, but their response has been very effective. And so far, they have been able to protect communities and protect lives and critical infrastructure in this country. At the same time, an important part of the discussion that we had today with my provincial and territorial partners is how we continue to build upon our capacity to respond to these events, how we improve coordination. And as we've also seen, that there are occasions, and 3 times so far this year, the provinces have asked us actually 4 times now, have made requests for assistance from the federal government. In those cases, we've brought additional personnel, mostly from the Canadian Armed Forces, but also from a number of other federal agencies, Parks and Rec, for example, Indigenous Services Canada. We've been able to respond in support, and as well, we've been able to assist in the acquisition of equipment and water bombers through our coordination efforts. And so right now, it's all hands on deck, and people are working hard, but we'll continue to assess our capacity to respond to these events. And at the same time, Cameron, I'd also point out that part of our discussion today with my federal provincial colleagues is how we build up greater resilience, how we mitigate and adapt to the new climate reality that's resulting in an increased severity and frequency of these events. And at the same time, then how do we make sure that our communities are stronger and more resilient, how we protect critical infrastructure, and most importantly, how we protect our citizens.
Any follow-up? All right, I'll take that as a no. Move on to Carol Sanders, Winnipeg Free Press. Please unmute and ask your question.
Hello. Can you hear me?
I can, absolutely.
Okay, good.
Go ahead.
I was just waiting for the unmute to work. Okay. I guess this message is for Minister Blair. Speaking of resilience and projects that have been going on for a while, or discussion of projects, there's the Lake Manitoba and Lake St. Martin outlet channels project and the flood mitigation for Peguis First Nation that has had historic flooding. And I'm wondering if Peguis or Lake Manitoba and Lake St. Martin outlet channels project came up in your discussions at all in terms of emergency preparedness and resilience and mitigation efforts.
Well, Carol, actually, it didn't come up in today's discussion with our FPT colleagues, but it is a subject that Mr. Piwniuk and I have had a number of discussions about, and I'd invite him as the minister responsible in Manitoba. We're his partners in those mitigation efforts. But Daryl or Doyle, was there anything you wanted to comment on?
Sorry, that mute button is always a tricky one. Yeah, so Carol, when it comes to the flood mitigations, right now we've actually on May 31st we did a submission for the environmental licensing with the federal government, and we actually did everything, all the checklists of what we needed to do to make sure that we get that approval. And we also did economic, social economics with First Nation communities. It wasn't a requirement, but we actually got it done anyways, just to make sure that we can move this project forward and making sure that we can start construction as soon as possible, as soon as we get the approval from the federal government to start with this channel. We have everything in place. We have contractors ready to go. We just need this environmental study to get approved, and we're good to go.
When do you expect that to take place?
Well, the submission went in May 31st. So we're hoping that by the end of the summer, early fall, that we will actually have the approval, much like what they did with the Delta port and in Vancouver. They got their approval. So we're hoping that that's kind of they're on a roll now to get all these licenses approved, including this one, because it's so vital with what happened in 2022. We want to make sure that we're ready for the future. Again, we're having some extremes. We want to make sure this project goes forward.
And you're talking about Lake Manitoba and Lake St. Martin waiting for environmental approval, correct?
That's right. That's right. The Lake St. Martin, Lake Manitoba, Lake St. Martin's outlet channels. And so that's why we want to get this stuff approved, because again, we don't want to see, if we ever have a 2011 or 14 all over again, we want to make sure that we have flood mitigation projects like the Winnipeg Red River floodway, the Portage diversion, and the Shawnee Dam this is the fourth opportunity to making sure that we be able to protect, especially communities along Lake Manitoba and Lake St. Martin's. And a lot of them are First Nation communities.
And PEGWIS is under study?
Yes, what's happening right now with PEGWIS, we're wanting to focus on that opportunity to get the Lake Manitoba, Lake St. Martin outlet channels done. But we're working right now to work with Indigenous Services Canada and in our own department to start looking at doing studies of when it comes to the land topography, making sure we have to look at the whole watershed basin when it comes to the Fisher River. So we are in talks already with PEGWIS First Nations, the federal government, Indigenous Services Canada, to start working on what we need to do. Like, what if there's engineering that has to be worked on? Do you look at our highway that goes through the community, and also looking at possible dikes and also channels that might have to be done. But again, that's going to be determined by the engineers, the professionals.
All right, that was a couple of follow-ups, but that's okay. I just thought I'd check and see, does anyone else have any further questions for either minister? All right, I see Stephen Jeffrey, Hill Times. Please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me now? I've had a little bit of a problem on my
I
end.
can, please go ahead.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for taking my question. This can be directed at probably both ministers, but the Federal National Adaptation Strategy was released yesterday. Some of that deals with emergency management, emergency preparedness, and it mentions the need for bilateral action plans between the federal government and provinces and territories. Was this mentioned sort of during the meeting today?
Thank you. I've just been unmuted, so I can respond to that if you'd like, Tim. I've been having trouble getting back in. Yeah, we actually talked about the national adaptation strategy in our meeting today. I, of course, was with Mr. Guilbeault and Mr. Wilkinson yesterday in British Columbia when we announced and presented the updated national adaptation strategy. We've talked about a number of different initiatives that are part of that strategy, including significant new investments in adaptation and resilience, which was also quite, as you can imagine, quite relevant to my provincial and territorial colleagues responsible for emergency management. We all recognize the importance of preparation and prevention and mitigation. Much of our work among the ministers that were engaged in the conversation today is in response to these emergency events. But we all see the real value in the development and implementation of adaptation strategies that will, first of all, reduce the impact of climate-related natural disasters, but also help build greater resiliency and reduce risk among communities and right across the country. We talked a little bit about the importance of investing in critical infrastructure and that is more resilient. And we talked about the disaster financial assistance arrangement, which I think is quite consistent with that approach to when we do bring federal resources to help communities that have been impacted by these natural disasters with the funding that is required to help them rebuild and recovery. We talked about the need of making sure that we invest that money in a smart way to help those communities not only rebuild, but to rebuild in a way that is much more resilient to future disaster, and to work with provincial, territorial, Indigenous, and municipal partners across the country to make sure that when they make decisions about where they'll build and how they'll build, that it's done in an informed way that actually helps communities and Canadians reduce their risk.
Any follow-up, Stephen? Alrighty, I'll take that as a no. We have time for one last question. If anyone has one, please raise your hand. Alrighty, well, that concludes today's event. If you have additional questions, please email our media relations team at media@ps-sp.gc.ca. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.